The President, please be seated. The President, Church Lowen, you may proceed, please.
Oui, Monsieur.
Very briefly, Mr. President, just to make sure that we are all entirely clear about what was said just now from the Kyo Sampan defense team, they stated that they did not see how it would be possible to begin a new trial until 002/1 had not been given a final judgment, so that everything is clear, because perhaps all the legal officers in this room do not necessarily adhere to the same system. So could you please just tell us exactly what you mean when you say having a final judgment? Counsel Gise, yes, a final judgment is a judgment that has been through the appeal phase, and once that is completed, we will take it that it is final. In other words, all of the essential questions on the issues such as modes of responsibility, which my team is particularly interested in, have been finally adjudicated upon. Thank you.
The President, thank you. Now, I would like to come to item number 2 on the discussion of the administrative aspects of trial management in case 002. The second item on the agenda concerns the administrative aspects of the trial management in case 002, and the Chamber directs its question to the ECCC Acting Director and Deputy Director of the Office of Administration. This question will assist the President of the Chamber to identify the range of possible options for the appointment of the second panel. The Chamber also notes that the defense teams for Nuon Chea and Keo Sampon have previously indicated that they have some concerns relating to the funding available to the defense. I would like to invite the Acting Director and Deputy Director of the Office of Administration to briefly describe the ECCC budget structure for the biannual budget 2014 and 2015 and the progress concerning its approval status. More particularly, could the Director and Deputy Director please discuss the funding situation of the ECCC, including the pledges and contributions already made, and the current and future fundraising effort made by the court to ensure that the required funding is made available. The Acting Director. Thank you, Mr. President, and good afternoon. In relation to the procedure of adopting the budget, and we draft the budget for every 2 years, the ECCC drafted its budget following its consultation with the section and the chambers at the ECCC. The drafting of the budget has been made in consultation, and we made together with the international side, and we forwarded the draft budget to the principal donor groups, and it was pending their review, and we hoped that we will have it approved in the near future, and it is now pending their review by the donors countries. The pledge, regarding the pledge, I cannot tell you we have any pledge at this time. Some countries told us that they could not make any pledge or any commitment by this time because in their countries there were an effort and a program to prepare their own budget. And Excellency Kaurimi, representative of the Royal Government of Cambodia, who briefed to the meeting on the achievement of the court, who said to New York that the government will remain support the counterpart fund by the government for the court. In addition to that, the current and updates of this process, we are waiting for the announcement by the donor country, especially the principal donors. In connection with that, in responding to your question number 2, as the ECCC is working on the voluntary fund by donor, especially the national side experience a shortfall in cash flow, and then the UN proposed to have a new mechanism to ensure that we will have provision or additional fund to respond to the cash flow problem at the ECCC. Cambodia supported this new mechanism to ensure the sustainability of the operation at the ECCC, and it is now being discussed at the United Nations at the 5th Committee of the UN. And I would like to give the floor to Knut Rosenhab to add more, especially on the mechanism whereby the 5th Committee of the United Nations are being reviewed, doing the review on that. The President, please go ahead, Mr. Knut.
Thank you very much. 2 issues have been tabled. One is the budget process. The second issue is the funding situation. So let's distinguish between two of these subjects. First, on the budget. The budget is, as said, a consultative process, both between the office administration and the units within the court. That process is completed, and the office administration have presented a budget proposal, a draft budget, in New York in November, and currently that proposal is being debated among the principal donors. There is ongoing questions and answers between the office administration and the donors. At times, the office administration seek clarifications from the units affected by the concrete questions. So that's where we are on the budget process. The reading that the two of us got from the pledging conference in New York in November and the meeting with the principal donors is that the donors stay committed to the court, they are supportive, and they are actively engaged in the articulation of the budget. So they are very much committed. Now, there has been no concrete tentative feedback on how much they are going to come on board with. It's also important to understand that when we have an approved budget, we have to do fundraising. Because we are, as you probably know by now, volunteer funded. So it's not similar to our siblings in The Hague, which is on the assessed budget. So when you have a budget, you also have the cash supporting it. So we have to go fundraising when we have an approved budget. So that leads me to the second issue of funding. Just to let the rabbit out of the basket immediately, how is the funding looking like as we speak? I will talk about the UN only. The acting director can address the national side. We expect, with the firm commitments made during the pledging conference in November and the time since then, to have an available balance on the 1st of January 2014 of $2.7 million. That has resulted in an extension of the staff contracts on the UN side for the first coming 3 months. And that process is now ongoing as we speak, the process of extending the contracts. In addition, we have firm commitments for an additional $4 million in the beginning of next year. So that is the 2.7 plus the 4. So that's the cash at hand. Now, one other fundraising activity is alluded to by the acting director, namely the Secretary General's request for subvention to the General Assembly. So this is a fundraising activity. This is not the budget. It's like asking any other sovereign state for funding. That process is cumbersome. It is basically 3 stops on that process. One is a group of experts, which is named ACABQ, the Advisory Committee for Budgetary and Management Issues. They have addressed the subvention request, and they have recommended it to the Financial Committee of the General Assembly. And the recommendation is, from the outset, to provide $12.4 million to the ECCC at the discretion of the Secretary General. Yesterday, there was a meeting in the 5th committee, which the ACABQ reports to. These are member states of the General Assembly. And they are currently, as we speak, discussing the request for subvention. The representative of the Secretary General, the controller, repeated the request for full subvention, namely the totality of the budget being funded in the interim by UN funds, to be replenished by volunteer funds if and when received. The 5th committee has not concluded on its debate, and they will continue debating this tomorrow, New York time, which is tonight, our time. So this process is very ongoing, and hopefully we will have a positive outcome anytime soon. Now, if that happens, if the recommendation is approved, we will have minimum $12 million available, which obviously, with an operational cost of around $2 million per month for the UN side, will lead us well into next year. So if the full subvention is approved, we clearly have full funding for throughout next year for both sides. There are technicalities around this which I'm not presenting. For instance, that subvention here will come with caveats, that this is a credit line to dip into when needed, and the principle of voluntary funding is not abolished. So the UN will, and the government for that matter, will still have an obligation to do active fundraising to replenish the UN money. But that's secondary for the purpose of this management meeting. Thank you.
The President, thank you. Judge Cartwright, you may proceed.
Yes, thank you very much, President. Thank you both to the Acting Director and the Deputy Director. I think the trial chamber is well aware that there are the two processes that we are discussing in this part of the trial management meeting. One is the budget process and the other is what we call the subvention document and the processes under that. I want to ask just a couple of questions about the budget process. You have made it clear that the budget draft budget proposed by the two of you has not yet been approved. It's still going through the normal processes, and that involves the principal donors group approving it and checking it, no doubt, on a line-by-line basis, as they have done always in the past. Can I just ask you about one question that you addressed to the trial chamber, which related to what staff and where can you make savings within the, in general, where can you make savings within the trial chamber? Because the principal donors group wants a $2 million reduction in your draft budget. Were you able to identify, because it was clear to us that it wasn't just from the trial chamber, were you able to identify savings from other chambers or offices of the court that would amount to $2 million, and have you put that to the principal donors group? That's the first issue.
Thank you. Yes, as said, the debate is ongoing, and there is a request from the principal donor group to try to achieve another 2 million reduction in the totality of the budget on both sides. We have not given the final feedback to that issue. The debate is still ongoing within the court. Will we be able to reach 2 million? Most likely not. But will we be able to produce some cuts? Yes.
Thank you. Now, subject to the ongoing discussion over the budget, you have told us that you have firm commitments for the 1st of January next year and other commitments for later in the year, which will amount to $6.7 million. When you say firm commitments, sadly, it's been the experience of the court in the past that firm commitments sometimes don't translate very quickly into money. But what exactly do you mean by firm commitments? Do you have the money in the bank? Do you have the cheque post-dated? Or is this a pledge which may or may not translate into cash? Oh, and I need to say that the reason that these questions are being asked, because the trial chamber fully acknowledges the Supreme Court's concerns that we are descending, apparently by the use of the word profanum in the Supreme Court judgment, into issues of finance. But the reason we feel obliged to ask some of these questions is that we have actually experienced disruptions in the current trial due to lack of money. And we need to build this into our planning for the rest of the trial 002 01 and then for future planning, whatever panel undertakes that. So that is the reasoning. So I just want to know, what do you mean by firm commitments? Have you got the money in the bank?
Firm commitment means that it is a stated promise from the giver, from the state. It's not money transferred to the United Nations, but I have no doubt whatsoever, and there is no experience in the past, that firm commitments have not been honored. All money promised have been transferred. I may add that the previous experience at this court on cash destruction has never occurred on the United Nations side. It has always been on the national side, and there has been no firm commitment at the time when these occasions happened, presented by donors. So it is not linked to the promises made by donors. They have always delivered on the promises.
And the next matter before we move to the second issue, which is what I call the subvention document, both you and the acting director have assured us today that there are contingency funds to cope with the ups and downs of the trials as they progress. For example, to allow for the appointment of a second panel and its support staff, also to allow for the reasonable workload of Defence Council, at least for the first 6 months of next year. Are those contingency funds that are currently available to you, or are they funds that have to be approved as yet under the budget process that is ongoing? And how much is in your contingency fund for both sides of the court?
The contingency funds is part of the budget process. So it is articulation in the budget that there are unforeseens next year, which is not plannable, and we have a lump sum for that purpose. Directly, how much? For the UN, it's 1.8 million for 14 and 1.6 for 15.
So obviously you are expecting that to be approved, but it is not yet approved because the budget process has not yet been finalised.
Correct.
President, if I may move briefly to the issue of subvention, that is a proposal for a new process for funding for the court. It is very helpful to learn that the ABCAQ has recommended this and that it is now being debated in the 5th Committee of the General Assembly. That's news, so that we're very grateful to hear that. The subvention document, however, does not deal with all of the problems, or a full subvention or even partial subvention were granted. It does not deal with all the problems that we might have in avoiding any future disruptions to the trials. I have to emphasise that only the international judges have been able to go through this document because it's only available in English. But I would like to ask you about paragraph 42, where the document says, the Secretary-General would therefore propose that he be given the discretionary authority to draw on the subvention in order to loan to the national component on a reimbursable basis such funds as are needed to ensure the funding of national staff salaries, excluding those of judicial officials. Now, so far there have been many disruptions because of staffing, failure to pay staffing salaries for extended periods. But what my national colleagues on the bench would not want to raise themselves, but which I feel obliged to raise, is that they too have not been paid, and indeed their salaries were not paid for a significant period after national staff salaries were paid. It appears that it is intended not to pay them at all in the future unless the royal government of Cambodia decides to do so outside of this subvention process. Is either the acting director or the deputy director able to reassure me that there will be no disruption because judicial salaries are not being paid?
Well, let me first maybe address why the Secretary General is articulating the request as he is, and then the acting director can address Article 15 of the agreement, putting this obligation to the government. The Secretary General is of the viewpoint that Article 15 overrides the request for subvention when it comes to judicial officials. They are officials of the government. Hence, the subvention money is not intended for the judicial officials, which is seen to be closer to the government's responsibility than project staff. On the other hand, in the Fifth Committee, the representative of the government of Cambodia has presented to the Fifth Committee a proposal to include the judicial officials in a subvention decision. So we do not know the outcome of that issue. Thank you.
Acting Director Tony Crane. In fact, the Office of the Administration made a request to the Fifth Committee to remove that phrase, but we do not know what the outcome will be.
One follow-up question, if I may. The subvention document specifically refers to judicial officials, which is the trial chamber's concern, lest there be any disruptions to the trial, the current one or any future trials. But are any other officials who are, for whom the royal government is responsible in terms of salary, are there any other officials within the court, for example, within the Office of the Administration, who have been affected by this same problem and who may themselves find themselves without salary in the future? Because that too might have a disruptive effect on the smooth administration to support the trials.
Acting Director, could you please repeat your question? I did not fully get it.
I'm very sorry. I'll repeat it. In the subvention document, and indeed it appears in the discussion before the Fifth Committee, the notion that the new method of funding would not apply to the national judges has been raised. What I want to know is, are there any other officials in the administration who would not be paid, or who in the past have suffered from non-payment of salaries, or is it just limited to the judges? Because if in the administration there are officials who are not being paid because the United Nations considers this to be the royal government's responsibility, then this too could have a serious impact on the smooth functioning of the administration, whose primary job is to support the court and its processes, including the trials. So are there any other officials than the national judges who might be affected?
Acting Director Tony Crane, thank you, Your Honor. Regarding the non-payment through the judges or legal officers, it only happened this year. 4 or 5 months ago, due to the lack of cash flow to pay the salary to the national staff, both the national and international sides agreed for the loan to deal with the issue, and to my knowledge, the loan is insufficient, and the UN itself requested that the payments shall be made to the lower weight staff and leave aside the judicial officials. And to my understanding, that is due to the lack of the funding or the lack of the total amount of the loan. Regarding paragraph 42 to be submitted before the 5th committee, I refer to the subvention document. The subvention is requested in such a way that the judicial officials shall be paid through as needed, if I can recall. And there is also an official request to remove the exclusion of the judicial officials for this subvention request.
Perhaps I'm sorry.
And at that time, the office of the and to respond to your questions, there is no staff in the administration who is affected by this.
From that last answer, do I infer that no staff in the administration have gone unpaid for any length of time? Is that what you're saying? So it's only the national judges who are at risk.
From
Acting Director Tony Crane. In 2013, we have sufficient money to pay for all the staff, including the judicial officers, and they have been paid those few months' salary that we owe them, and they have been paid in full, including the judicial officials and the judges. And also we have the money to pay for the December salary.
Thank you. I fully appreciate that it's not your decision who to pay and who not to pay, but the issue over judges is a far more fundamental one, even than legal officers, for whose situation we have the utmost concern and sympathy. It goes to the independence of the judiciary and their ability to function without worrying about money or being forced to find other means to support their families. Has that issue been raised internally in the administration or externally to the donors or to the royal government, which the UN says is responsible for their payment?
Response: no. In general, the salary for the national staff is paid, And sometimes when there is a shortage of cash flow, we try our best to deal with the payment of the salary. And the issue of excluding the judicial officials, the idea was suggested by those who provided us the loan. And of course we had emergency funding from the Royal Government of Cambodia to supplement the shortfall. So in fact there is no discrimination at all for the judicial officer, and it was not subject to discussion because the salary has to be paid without any discrimination on anyone.
Yes, thank you. Perhaps the Deputy Director could comment on the issue of failure to pay judges has some impact on their independence. Would you be able to assist us in any way in this regard?
On the last question, I don't know, but I will try to give a comment. First of all, it's very unfortunate that judicial officials are not paid salary they are due. So let that be absolutely clear. Secondly, there has been no subvention in the past. So though there is a reference to subvention and articulation in the subvention request, that has not been the scenario in the past. This is the first subvention. What was the scenario in the past was that there was no donor coming forward to the national side, and the government was not footing the bill according to Article 15. So you had a cash flow problem, which then led to salaries not being paid. The UN then requested donors on its side to redirect funding, which was initially earmarked for the UNACART staff at the court, to redirect these funds to the national side as an interim measure. Those donors approached, they concurred, and the money was then forwarded to the national side on the instruction of those donors, with the caveat that the judicial officials would not be included in these funds. And judicial officials, I think, I take it from the top of my head now, was broader than the chambers. I believe the co-prosecutor was also not paid for the similar time period. So it's all judicial officials. Also, my colleague next to me was also not paid for a duration of time because one of the conditions on the second loan was priorities given to the lower ranks, and second priority was given to P5s and above. So only when the money sufficed, you could go beyond P4. So those on P5 and D1 also suffered then for a period of time. Now, you may have learned that when it was sort of clear to the government that no volunteer funding was coming forward, the government did honor its obligation and did transfer 1.8 million to the court, which then facilitated the payment of the arrears and until the end of the year. So that's how that issue was resolved. Unfortunate, clearly, but I choose not to have an opinion on the independence of the judiciary.
President, thank you, and Judge Lavenge, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Firstly, I just want to summarize the current state of finances, not talk about the forecast for next year, but talk about the current fiscal year, talk about the budget as it stands today. If I understand correctly, based on the information that has been given to me, it would appear that for the international side, the sum of voluntary contributions from the states has been completely spent. I would like to know exactly where the funds that are currently financing the operations of the ECCC are coming from. And do these funds come from the United Nations? And do they form part of the subvention that is currently in discussion in New York? I just want to have an idea of the figures, the concrete numbers, and that is the funds allocated which do not come from the state voluntary contributions.
Okay, so thank you. On the national side, there is no UN money. On the national side, it's donor money and the money from the government. That brings the national side to the end of this year and beyond, I believe. For the United Nations, we have, as I articulated earlier, firm commitments for the current year, which will end the year in surplus. Now, on request, I said that this is not necessarily money in the bank account, because the money has to be transferred and the banks use whatever time they use to transfer money. So, if need be, the UN is advancing cash from its own cash, and then it's replenished by the volunteer funds when received. That is only an issue at the end of the month when the salary is due.
You have told us that the subvention request was part of a fundraising exercise. Is this something that is distinctive from the budget approval process? Nevertheless, can you please tell us, within the documents that are currently being examined in New York, is there any mention of the expenditures that would relate to the establishment of a second panel of judges?
No.
From a budgetary standpoint, is it possible to proceed with the recruitment of a second panel of judges when such expenditures have not been approved, and unless I'm mistaken, when the entire budget has not received approval? Can you please tell us when the budget is going to be approved? And once approved in its current state, it doesn't foresee the appointment of a second panel of judges, and would this not give rise to a certain number of difficulties vis-à-vis the appointment of new judges or the recruitment of support staff to assist the second panel of judges?
Okay, this is about the budget. It's not about the subvention. In the budget, as said, there is a line called contingency. And for the national side, it's called General Technical Assistance, GTA, as a lump sum. When we receive a request to do unforeseen activities, which is not plannable, we will have to go back to the owners of those money, basically the principal donor group, and ask to be allowed to use that contingency amount for this specific purpose. So we have alerted them to the need of an unforeseen funding, but we have obviously not told them what this unforeseen activity is, because we do not know.
Alors,
let's get down to the number crunching and more concrete matters. Are you telling us that the current cost of the operations of the trial chamber, can we please have an idea of what the cost is? Because if a second panel of judges is indeed designated, we should foresee a relatively equivalent budgetary item. What is the scale of the expenditures for the establishment of a second panel of judges?
The office administration do not scale the second panel. We react to a request. We do not know the composition of a second panel. We do not know how many support staff is needed by that panel or current panel. We have not quantified or costed any of those activities.
sauf erreur de ma part,
Now, unless I'm mistaken, it would appear to me that you undertook a rather in-depth assessment in order to answer the Supreme Court. And so you're telling me that you have absolutely no idea whatsoever of what costs will be incurred? Now, even if you don't have an idea, can you please tell us what is the current cost of the operations of the trial chamber with the judges and with the staff supporting the judges?
I can, but I do not have the expenditure table with me. I have the budget with me, and I will have to answer you later on that concrete amount, on what the current cost of the trial chamber is. But I may add that we have never been informed by the chamber that we need to double up. The composition of the alternative process is not known to us.
sauf erreur de
Now again, unless I am mistaken, in the context of the review that you undertook to respond to the Supreme Court, you did not consult the trial chamber. Now, I also gather, unless again I am mistaken, that the contingency fund hovers around $1.8 million for the next financial year. Can you please tell us if $1.8 million will allow us to cover all of the expenses that would entail the establishment of a second panel of judges?
Okay, first, maybe a factual correction. I did consult with the trial chamber on the establishment of a second panel, as articulated in the memo to the Supreme Court. We met with the president of the trial chamber for this purpose, and it's spelled out in the memo that we did so. Secondly, 1.8 million represent a percentage of the totality. It is not quantified in any other way. It's a percentage of the total cost. Now, yes, I believe that is sufficient to finance any alternative at the minimum in the interim, which will allow us to get back to the principal donor group and ask them for a revision of the budget to accommodate a potential higher need. So at least this will not hold up any commencement of an alternative process.
Sorry. Est-ce que
Does this contingency fund, are these contingency funds available? Are they subject to any approval process? What can you tell us about this current status of this contingency fund?
I believe I have addressed this earlier by saying that the budget is not approved, hence the contingency fund is not available. Is it just to dip into? No. Any activity which is not planned will have to go back to the principal donor group who owns this money, and we will have to ask for their permission to use it for this purpose. So it's not available at the discretion of the two directors.
It's rather late in the hour, and perhaps I'm having trouble understanding, but I believe that you talked about the date on which the budget would be approved. So can you just tell us where we are at? I understand that the budget was approved rather late this year, yet approval for the next budget has already begun. Can you please provide us a few comments on that?
I think it must be rather late in the evening. The budget is not approved.
Ce n'était pas ma question.
That was not my question. I wanted to know, when do you think it would be possible to see a decision for approval of the budget? Now, I understand that the budget has not been approved. I want to know, when do you believe that it will be possible to receive a decision approving the budget allocated for the ECCC?
That is at the discretion of the principal donor group. I cannot speculate in a date. It's fluent. The ongoing discussion is mature. We are at the end of that process, and it can happen anytime soon.
Just as an indication, however, can you please tell us when the most recent budget was approved? The budget for the current year and the next year, if you are in a position to tell us.
The current budget is the second year of the previous, or the last budget period, which was approved 2 years ago. The budget we are now debating with the donor group is for the next 2 years, 14 and 15. And both years are approved in the same package.
I think we have a problem of understanding each other. Can you please give us an illustration, some sort of indication as to when the budget for the previous budget was approved? Was it in July, February, March of this year, or the previous year?
The current budget was approved 2 years ago, so clearly not this year.
Et quand?
And when exactly? When exactly was that budget approved? Was it in the month of January or in the month of September of that year?
I have to take this from my memory. I obviously don't have that date here. I can give it to you later on, but I believe it was in February 2 years ago.
Je vous remercie, monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Director.
President, thank you. I think the time is appropriate for an adjournment. It's rather taxing today for everyone. And before we adjourn, I'd like to inform all the parties that for tomorrow's meeting, tomorrow morning the Chamber will give the floor to the parties to put the questions to the Acting Director and Deputy Director regarding the administrative aspects of trial management in case 002. Before the Chamber continue on to another item, there is item number 3, the scope of case 002/02. And we will adjourn today's meeting now. And we will resume tomorrow morning commencing from 9 a.m. And I would like to invite all of you once again to attend it. Thank you. and security guards instructed to take Kyu Sampon back to the detention facility and have him return to participate in the meeting before 9 a.m. tomorrow. Please bring him to the holding cell downstairs and arrange for the connection of the AV so that he can follow the meeting remotely.